Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Gaudette, and welcome back to another installment of Top 5 Albums, the series where I take you through my 5 favorite albums from each year. Today, we are going to be talking about the year 1968, another very solid year for 60s music that saw the continuation of a lot of different styles of music that had developed in the previous years, with genres like psychedelic, folk rock, art rock, blues, country, and jazz is continuing to evolve into more avant-garde directions. And we also see the introduction of some progressive rock elements as well that was developing in England at the time, and that is a style of music that would become more and more prevalent in the coming years. And we get some early glimpses of that in 1968, so another thing that is very exciting about this year. And a very exciting time for music as we see a lot of different evolutions continue to play out as we approach a new decade. So I think it's time to jump into it. Here are my top 5 favorite albums from 1968, starting with number 5. Okay, coming in at number 5 is Bookends by Simon and Garfunkel. This is their 4th studio album, and in my opinion, at this point in their discography, this is when their songwriting really started to reach their peak, and they put out some of their most exceptional individual tracks to date. Side 1 is a concept album which resembles the journey of going from childhood to old age, and each track resembles a different stage of that process. And Side 2 consists of a couple of singles that had not been released, as well as a few unused tracks for the movie The Graduate, which they had done the soundtrack to earlier in the same year. And I think Paul Simon's writing throughout this album is some of the most exceptional and beautiful stuff that he has written of the entire Simon and Garfunkel discography. And it definitely contains a few tracks that would easily be regarded as some of my favorite Simon and Garfunkel songs. Side 1 opens and closes with this short little guitar theme titled Bookends Theme, and I think it's a really nice way to open and close Side 1, which is the concept album side of this record. The two songs on Side 1 that I really think are absolutely exceptional are America, which is a Simon and Garfunkel classic, and I think anybody who is a big Simon and Garfunkel fan loves that song. But there's another track on here that I think is kind of a really unsung hero of this album, and it's titled Old Friends. I think that song is absolutely beautiful, really pretty chord movements, great vocal melodies, and the instrumentation on this one is just absolutely gorgeous. I love the additional layer of richness and depth that the violins add to this song. And in my opinion, this is one of the most underrated Simon and Garfunkel songs. I'm surprised that this one didn't become a hit because I think this song is an absolute masterpiece and would definitely be one of my favorite songs by them. And Side 2 is a very tasteful contrast to Side 1 with a couple of other really standout tracks like Punky's Dilemma, Mrs. Robinson, and A Hazy Shade of Winter. And although these two sides are not necessarily related and were written for different reasons, I think they still go very well together, and like I said, I do think they provide a nice little contrast and change of pace from Side 1 to Side 2. So I don't really take issue with the fact that this album wasn't initially recorded with the idea of it being, a full, completely fleshed out album, and it was, the concept album for Side 1 and then the soundtrack and unreleased singles from Side 2. I really don't take issue with that, and I think it works fine together. And one other thing that I should say is I don't think this is a perfect album. It does have a track or two on here that I'm not crazy about, but I think the good songs are so exceptional. And like I said, in the grand scheme of the Simon and Garfunkel discography, this album probably has the largest amount of my favorite songs by them. And I think the good songs on here are just so good that it really carries the weight of the entire album. And even though there might be a song or two that I'm not crazy about, I still think that this album is largely incredible. And we've talked about this on previous episodes of this series, where a lot of times you have this album that's almost perfect, but then there's like one or two songs that take away from it a little bit, but the rest of the album is so good that you still hold it in such a high regard. And this would be another example of an album that I definitely feel that way about. And if you're interested in hearing a more in-depth review of the entire Simon and Garfunkel discography, I did a video ranking all of their albums. And if you're interested in seeing that, you can check out the tier list playlist, which will be in the comments and the description. And yeah, a great album to come out of 1968 with Paul Simon's songwriting really reaching its peak. So that's my number 5. Now on to number 4. All right, coming in at number 4 is Speak Like a Child by Herbie Hancock, an absolute gem of an album to come out of that post-bop and hard-bop genre. And for anybody who hasn't watched the previous episodes where I explain what post-bop and hard-bop is, it's basically a genre of jazz that started to become developed in the 60s, where people were starting to write songs with a little bit more unorthodox characteristics, like the utilization of non-functional harmony, which basically means that you're utilizing some more unorthodox chord movements that can't really be derived from traditional major and minor scales, and also just the use of more unorthodox chord voicings and, more dissonant sorts of harmonic movements going on. And I've always been a huge fan of Herbie Hancock as a songwriter, and when it comes to his compositions, particularly in that hard bop and post bop sort of realm, I think this album has some of the strongest songwriting that he has put out within that style. It's got 6 songs, with 5 being written by Herbie and 1 being written by legendary bassist Ron Carter. As far as personnel goes, we have Herbie Hancock on piano, Ron Carter on bass, Mickey Roker on drums, and for the horn section, we have Jerry Dodgian on the alto flute, Thad Jones on the flugelhorn, and Peter Phillips on bass trombone. And I really like the choice of instruments within this horn section because it is definitely not a typical type of horn section that you would normally encounter in a lot of jazz music. And I think the unique choices and the different types of sounds that can be achieved with this, very dynamic sort of horn section, I think creates some really magical sounds. And pairing that with Herbie's just incredible compositional styles creates some really wild and just very interesting sorts of textures, and just works beautifully with all of these songs. And there is a large part of this album that I do think has a very dark and eerie sort of mood to it, and I do think a big part of that is the choice of horn section, which I think works very effectively. And Herbie Hancock is one of my all-time favorite jazz piano players, and he just takes some ridiculous solos on this album. My personal favorite would be on the opening track titled Riot. That song is so cool and just has such an aggressive sort of mood to it, and the solo he takes on that one just brings you into another dimension. Herbie's sense of building a story throughout his solos is second to none, and you never know what you're going to expect, and you always know it's going to be a wild experience whenever Herbie takes a solo, and you hear that all throughout this record. I love every song on here, but if I had to narrow it down to a few, I would say that my favorites are Riot, Toys, and the closing track, The Sorcerer. In the mid-60s were really a very productive and magical time for Herbie as a songwriter, with his previous album being Maiden Voyage, where he produced a couple of other classic post-bop sorts of songs with the track Maiden Voyage and Dolphin Dance. So I think Herbie was really on the top of his game in the mid-60s. He's really always on the top of his game, but I think, when it comes to his hard bop and post-bop compositions, I think this was really the best time of his songwriting for that particular style of music. And I also really like the track that Ron Carter contributes on this album. I think it balances out the mood of Herbie's tracks really nicely and gives us something that's a little bit brighter and kind of picks things up a little bit. And I like that they included that track on this album. So if this sounds like the type of jazz record that you might be intrigued by, I would definitely give it a listen and see what you think. I don't think you will be disappointed. All right, that is my number 4 album. Now on to number 3. All right, coming in at number 3 is Friends by the Beach Boys. This one is a little hidden gem in the Beach Boys discography, and I would say it's one of their most underrated albums. There are so many little things about this record that I think make it really unique within the Beach Boys catalog. It's recorded in a pretty lo-fi sort of way and was done in Brian Wilson's home studio, and this is really like the most hippie sort of album to come out of the Beach Boys discography, with a lot of songs being written about, meditation and mindfulness. And the Beach Boys had been on a spiritual quest during the time of this album, and they were studying transcendental meditation with Maharishi, who is the same person that George Harrison had studied under and had a big impact on some of his songwriting within the later part of the Beatles discography. And Brian Wilson is in the driver's seat for the majority of this album, which is another reason why I think the quality of the songwriting is so high throughout this. But another thing that is very unique about this album is we get to hear the first track that Brian Wilson and Al Jardine wrote in collaboration together, and we also get to hear a couple of tracks that Dennis Wilson either collaborated on or wrote entirely by himself. And I think Dennis Wilson is one of the unsung heroes of the Beach Boys, and it's great to start to hear his songwriting come into fruition on this record. And if you're unfamiliar with the genius of Dennis Wilson, I would recommend checking out his solo album, Pacific Ocean Blue. I think his songwriting speaks for itself on that record and shows you how great of a songwriter he truly is. So a lot of cool things happening throughout this record with, different members starting to collaborate and, contribute some of their own songs, as well as the interesting period for the Beach Boys with the interest in the meditation and how it influenced the types of songs and subject matters that they would write about. And this album is a very easy listen. It's relatively short at only about 25 minutes in length, but I think every song on here is awesome. The album has a great pacing. It's got some really exceptional Brian Wilson tracks, as well as some amazing collaborations. And in general, I just really love the beautiful, peaceful, and serene mood that this album gives off. It's definitely a feel-good sort of album, which I think was a very good choice in mood for where they were at this point in their career and their spiritual exploration. My personal favorite songs on here would be Friends, Wake the World, Be Here in the Morning, Annalie the Healer, and Be Still, which is an absolutely beautiful short Dennis Wilson ballad. And as I've mentioned in previous episodes, my number one favorite Beach Boys album is Pet Sounds. My second is The Beach Boys Today. And believe it or not, this one very well might be my third favorite Beach Boys album. I've always been a little conflicted. I have a couple of albums that kind of switch off in the number 3 spot depending on what mood I'm in. But, this one can pretty regularly fall into my number 3 favorite Beach Boys album. So if you haven't heard this one yet, I would highly recommend checking it out. Like I said, I think it's a real hidden gem from their discography, and I think everybody in the group is contributing really solid stuff, and I think it makes for just a very enjoyable and easy listen that I would regard as one of the most underrated Beach Boys albums. So that is my number 3. Now on to number 2. Okay, coming in at number 2 is Birthday by The Association. This is a criminally underrated record. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this is one of the most underrated albums of the 60s, in my opinion. I'm willing to bet that most people watching this video have probably never heard of this album, and a lot of people are not even aware of who The Association is, and they were a very pivotal group when it comes to 60s music. A lot of people oftentimes might know their hit songs like Windy and Never My Love, but they don't necessarily know the band that wrote those tracks. But they are a seriously amazing band to come out of the 60s, and I would regard this as their best album, hands down. Stylistically, it's in a sort of psychedelic, pop, art rock sort of realm with a really great combination of covers and originals, and we have session musicians playing throughout this, so we have, really big instrumentations that add such a nice additional layer to these already amazing songs. The production is top-notch and really captures that perfect blend of psychedelic and pop. It also has a very cool cover, which I think is very psychedelic. And the blending of different styles from track to track makes for a very fun and adventurous listen where you never know what's going to come next. And when it comes to individual association songs, this album by far has the largest amount of my favorite songs by them and contains my number 1 favorite song of theirs, which is titled Barefoot Gentleman. Just the perfect art rock track with really interesting and colorful chord movements, beautiful vocal melodies and harmonies, and a massive instrumentation that takes this already amazing song and makes it even more powerful and beautiful. A perfect song, in my opinion. My other favorites on here would be Rose Petals, Incense and a Kitten, Toy Maker, and The Time It Is Today. I really cannot say enough good things about this album, and if you are a fan of 60s pop, psychedelic, and art rock, I would highly recommend checking out this album because there are so many hidden gems all throughout this track listing, and I'm really amazed that this album is not more well known because it is truly just a masterpiece of a record that would go down as my number 2 favorite album of 1968. All right, so now it is time for the grand reveal. Here is my number 1 favorite album of 1968. All right, coming in at number 1, my favorite record of 1968 is the Notorious Byrd Brothers by the Byrds. This album is an absolute masterpiece and, in my opinion, is by far the best record of their discography. This would be the final album that they would put out before going through a personnel change and shifting their style into more of a country territory, which was a big shift from a lot of the stuff that they did on the albums prior to that. And I think this album represents the peak of their creativity as well as their collective songwriting. A lot of great collaborations going on throughout these tracks with each member of the group adding their own individual flavors. And the album has a lot of different stylistic elements going on with this really great blend of psychedelic, folk rock, baroque pop, and a little bit of jazz and country as well. The instrumentation is very strong with a lot of session musicians playing throughout the album, which adds some really nice additional color and beauty to these already amazing songs. And the record is almost entirely originals, with 2 carefully chosen Carole King covers, which are both very beautiful. And the originals on this record are top-notch, absolutely incredible, and in my opinion, the strongest original material that they have produced from their entire discography. This album definitely contains the largest amount of my favorite Byrds songs, and it has so many high points, but if I had to narrow it down to a couple of favorite tracks, some of them would be Going Back, Get to You, Draft Morning, Changes Now, Tribal Gathering, and Dolphins Smile. Really hard to narrow it down though, because there are so many bangers all throughout this album. And all of the songs are just so adventurous and unique. And one thing that I love about this record is it is probably the furthest thing from cliche. Nothing about this music sounds generic, and you never know what to expect. And like I said, each member of the band is contributing beautiful stuff, putting in all of their unique individual flavors, which creates just this beautiful, magical stew of the Byrds for this final album before they were to undergo some personnel changes and kind of change their stylistic direction. But this is by far my favorite album of the Byrds' discography. And if you are interested in hearing a more in-depth review of all of the Byrds albums, I did a video ranking their entire discography. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out in the tier list playlist, which will be in the comments and the description. And yeah, that's it for today. Those are my top 5 albums. So to recap, number 5 was Bookends by Simon and Garfunkel. Number 4 was Speak Like a Child by Herbie Hancock. Number 3 was Friends by the Beach Boys. Number 2 was Birthday by The Association. And number 1 was The Notorious Byrd Brothers by the Byrds. Thanks so much for watching, and if you check out any of these albums that you haven't heard before, please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear what you think of some of these, and I would also love to hear what your 5 favorite albums are from 1968, so please let me know. Alright, that's it for today. Thanks again for watching, and stay tuned for my top 5 favorite albums of 1969. I'll see you then. Take care.